Our speaker tonight is Mr. Bill Mason. Mr. Mason is not well, he wasn't an American citizen. I imagine you are by now, right? Naturalized. He was from Canada, of all things. Grew up in Ontario. Well, he grew up in Ontario and Toledo, so he's sort of a mix here. 1942, he joined the RCAF and became a pilot with the Bomber Command. And he flew on 3 kinds of planes: Wellington bombers, Halifaxes, and ended his career successfully. Just barely successfully, though, in the Lancasters. Bill flew in 53 bombing missions, and he limped home on 3 engines on 3 different occasions, once having his plane accidentally hit by British anti-aircraft. How they could have missed the Lancasters, I have no idea. He was also inducted into the Canadian Veterans Hall of Fame. So without further ado, Mr. Bill Mason, take it away.
Well, today is June the 7th, which is an important day because it's the day after D-Day. And I think you've probably seen enough about that on the television. Our squadron, we were considered the heavies, and the air over the Channel and Normandy and so forth was going to be so crowded, they grounded us for that day and issued us with a sidearm. They thought for sure that the Germans would drop paratroopers as soon as D-Day happened, but it didn't happen that way. So I could turn the sidearm in the next day, and that was it. And I saw in yesterday's paper where Medina has some pretty good girl lacrosse players. I got that right? They won the state championship? So that kind of rang a bell when I saw that. Regardless of what I say, I consider myself damn lucky. And she was looking after me. And when I heard that you had this roundtable here, I thought, World War II, I thought everybody forgot about that. But it's nice to know that that didn't happen. I'm 91, and I'm looking forward to 100. It's only a number, and mine's unlisted. I'm going to bore you with some World War II stories. When Tim asked me to come, he said, well, will your wife come? And I said to her, well, will you come? And she said, I've heard all your stories. The World War II was an entirely different war than what's going on there now. I mean, there weren't any robots or guided missiles, or it was almost like personal contact with what was going on. And my wife says, would never have gotten back from Germany if it hadn't been for your navigator. And that's true too, because I get lost in the Avon Lake. My whole motivation to joining the Air Force in 1942 was I wanted to learn to fly, and there were a lot of young fellows, same as I, that really weren't interested in the war. We just wanted to learn to fly, and that was a way to do it. What actually happened to me, I graduated from high school in Toledo, Scott High School, and I went to the University of Toledo for a couple years, and still with the idea I'd like to learn to fly. U.S. Air Force recruiting committee came to University of Toledo and interviewed the ones that were interested and signed me up. and they posted me to Chanute Field. Well, when I got there, the person that was reviewing my file, he said, well, I see here you were born in Canada. He says, what proof of citizenship do you have? And I said, citizenship? What's that? And he said, well, we can't take you. And they were different then. Now if you went in, I think they'd make you a citizen right away. But anyway, so they sent me home. And I guess if I look back on that, I was an illegal alien. Anyway, one night I was in a bar, and I saw a fellow that I'd gone to high school with in a Royal Canadian Air Force uniform. And I got talking to him, and he said, I'm stationed at Goderich, which is just above Detroit in Canada. And he said, if you drive me back, I'll buy your gas. And and this is how loose they were. He said, you can live with me and I'll take you flying. Well, that was great. I went up there and I stayed there about 3 days, and this guy took me all around, and I thought, this is it. So I drove down to Windsor and joined up. And in April 1942, I was posted to Toronto Manning Depot. That's what they called it. It was like a boot camp. And that was probably eventually the best physical condition I was ever in my life. They really worked us out. And then from there, and that's where we got our, our inoculations, and they kept us quarantined for a while, and issued us our uniforms and all of those details. And so from there, I went to elementary flying school at St. Eugene, which is up on the Ottawa River. And my solo story, my instructor, after I'd been there for about probably 5 or 6 hours, I should look in my logbook, but he said, I'm not going to let you kill me. He said, go. So I took off and went around and came down to land. And when I went to land, I went in too steep, and it was a biplane, and it bounced, started to go this way, right towards another plane where there was an instructor standing there with a student. It turned out it was my instructor. And I almost did kill him. Anyway, I got enough throttle to get over him, and I went around, but then I didn't know when I could come back. I think I spent about a half an hour getting up enough nerve to come back after that. Anyway, I went on to what they called SFTS, which was advanced, and I flew what the Canadians called the Harvard, which is an AT-6, which was a U.S. trainer or a Canadian trainer, single engine, quite an airplane. It had 650 horsepower, made a lot of noise. And you could do rolls from straight and level and a lot of things with it. And that's what I got my wings on. And my commission at the same time in 1943. And then I went off to England. And of course they put me with the RAF, which is the British Air Force. And I thought maybe I could get on P-51 Mustangs, which sounded great. Well, they didn't think that way. They needed multi-engine pilots, so they sent me to Scotland, and I converted to multi-engine. The Lancaster, as you can see there and here, is quite an airplane. It's got 4 Merlin engines, Rolls-Royces, develops 8,000 horsepower, Um, it could get up with a full load on, which was, it would take 8 1,000 pounders in the Bombay, which is 8 ton, 16 1,000, what did I say? Anyway, it would take 16 1,000, and its all up weight was something like 65,000 pounds. In the summertime, it would get up to close to 20,000 feet, and with a full load on. And in the winter, it would get up to maybe 25,000 feet. So it was a good airplane. And it took a beating. The engines were a little sensitive because they were liquid cooled. And if you got flak in them, you had a fire. But, would cruise at 300 miles an hour. Of course, eventually it ended up on Pathfinders, which meant we had to do everything exactly the way they told us, because they want us to be plus or minus a minute. That sounds impossible after a 9-hour flight. Plus or minus a minute from what they called H hour, which was the start of the target. I bought a car when I got to England. I had a 1934 Austin 10. Top speed was like 45 miles an hour, but that was all right for those roads. And I got to know a family near where I was stationed, and we got coupons for the petrol, as they say, and I would deposit those coupons when we got them every month at a certain station, and I could go there and buy my fuel, and they weren't too they weren't too particular about whether you actually had used the coupons or not. I mean, you just sort of went there and bought. Plus, I knew this family, and they were in Chatteris, which was a little town right near where I was stationed. And this gentleman owned 14 lorries, the big trucks, and he would buy crops on speculation, and then when the crop came ready, he would load up these trucks and take it to the markets in London. So he got a special petrol allowance. So whenever I would go to visit him, he'd fill my car up too. And of course the thing was, the police could stop you, and they had a test tube, and they'd take the petrol out of the tank, and if it had a certain color, it was illegal. But being in uniform, they wouldn't do that. I got stopped a number of times, and they just say, as soon as they look in and see you in there, they wave you on. So that was kind of, and that saved my sanity. Eventually, I got on Pathfinders, flying the same machine, and we were marking the targets. Well, there were some advantages and disadvantages. One advantage was if you were first in and first out of the target area, they hadn't got themselves organized yet, didn't know where you were going because there was diversions. They used to send so many units out in this direction, and the main force was going in that direction. Like, for example, if Berlin was the target that night, Hanover or something would be the diversion target. And that kept them on their toes and kind of fooled them till they saw what was happening. And they always had the mainstream going this way and then making at the last minute, or more or less, making a turn right into the target. So he didn't know till the last minute where you were really going. all those kind of things. The disadvantage in being in Pathfinders was that Jerry liked to shoot down the Pathfinders. That would spoil the whole scene. So you got picked on too. But when they started Pathfinders, see, Bomber Harris was the air marshal in charge of the Bomber Command. And he hired right away, or transferred him, a fellow named Bennett, who had been an Australian pilot before the war, and when the war started, he switched over to the RAF, and he became RCO. And he was quite a guy. He flew his own airplane, and he'd come in there. He could show up at briefing anywhere, anytime. And he was the guy that set our standards. He's the one that had the beautiful idea that it would be plus or minus a minute. But anyway, he was a great guy. You had to be, I never did find out, but you had to have something special to get to Pathfinders. Like, I thought it was my navigator because he was good. But the only way you stayed there was if Bennett was impressed. If he didn't think you were performing, he'd send you back to the squadron you came from, that kind of thing. So I felt pretty important staying there. And I made a total of 53 trips, of which 40 were in Pathfinders. And one of the things that the English, I thought, they were great people, but they were terrible cooks. And the food was not that great. And we were on powdered eggs, but the squadron were smart enough to go and buy real eggs from the local farmers. And so we would be given one real egg a week. And they had a rack in the kitchen with your name, all the names of the air crew, and you could ask the cook and he would do it. He would fix that egg any way you wanted it. And so the favorite expression was, if you were going on a trip that night, you were on the battle order, and a buddy of yours wasn't flying that night, you'd say to him, if I don't come back, you can have my egg. After we finished our first tour, I told my crew, we'll never say it's our last trip. That's bad luck. We'll come down some night when somebody in the crew has had enough, and if he says I quit, we all quit. So that's what we actually did. So we went to Hamburg on the 53rd trip, and my mid-upper gunner got out, and he's standing there, and he says, Skipper, I quit. So we all quit. And that's the way I finished up. I guess I can't say enough about my crew. I had a Canadian navigator who had been a draftsman with a big construction firm in Canada. And I guess that when he finished a trip, the navigation leader used to take his log and put it up on the bulletin board and say, this is the way we want it. He was very precise, and I think that had something to do with it. My engineer had been in peacetime, he was in the RAF as a mechanic. He was out in Aden and Eritrea, you know, the Red Sea area. And he volunteered for air crew and came back to England and got trained, and I got him. And he was very good. I don't want to get into all the details of what the crew, what their jobs were. You can guess that, I'm sure. One of his biggest jobs was keeping track of the petrol so that we averaged out so many gallons an hour so that we could get back. And he watched that very carefully, and we used to average about 200 gallons an hour. One night we got way off course. We were going to Kassel, which is a town south of the Ruhr Valley, which we used to call Happy Valley. And we got drifted off course because my navigator was going on this is early in the trip, he was going on the Met winds, the winds that were given to him at briefing, and they were almost the opposite when we got over Germany. So we got shot up over Cologne, and we lost an engine, and we couldn't get up above 16,000 feet. But it was an argument with myself: do we press on, or do we turn around and go by ourselves back? Well, I decided we press on. So we got to the target all right, and unfortunately, the engine that we lost was the compressor for the power system for the rear turret. So my rear gunner is back there doing his search, but he's doing it by hand. And he picked, the gunners used to practice hours, night vision, and we flew everything at night. And maybe that's why I'm so good after dark now, I don't know. But anyway, he was pumping his turret by hand, and he picked up an ME-110 that was coming in on us, and he opened fire on it. And of course, I went into evasive action, and as soon as he started with all this tracer flying from his turret, his 4 guns, the mid-upper, of course, swung right around, and there was all kinds of stuff flying. And that ME-110 left us. Unfortunately, he shot off our aerial. He shot off our port rudder. And other than that, we got away with it and got back. And there was another mark for luck. Anyway, when Gordy said I quit, my thought was, I want to get back to Canada, get back to university, and get that piece of paper. So I walked away from the war, and I ended up being posted to Kingston, Ontario, that's where Queen's University is. So fortunately, I was able to get in there because the Canadian kids have to have 5 years of high school to get in an engineering course. And I didn't have 5 years. I only had the 2 years at the University of Toledo. But I thought I was going to go in my 3rd year or something, and 4th year and be out. Well, the dean, I got my transcripts from University of Toledo, and I went in to see the dean of engineering, Dean Ellis. And he looked at this stuff and he said, well, they might teach you to be a good citizen, and you don't have senior matriculation, that's what they called it, 5 years. I think what you should do, I'll give you a permit. You can sit in on some classes. He says, you've been out of school a while, and then you decide what you want to do. And come back and see me. So I did. I attended. I went to calculus, and I went to physics, and I sat in on lectures, and I figured out how far away I was from it. And so I went back and I told Ellis, I said, I think I'll start over. And I had enough, see, the Canadian government was going to pay for it, and I had enough years in the service that it would pay for 4 years say at Queens. So anyway, that's what I did, and I graduated finally in '49. And then I worked for a while in industry after I graduated, and finally ended up at NASA here at the airport in 1962. And I think that was a great place to work. And I enjoyed all the time I was there. I retired from there in '88. Then I went to work for a friend, and finally retired in '94. I don't know how to express, and I think about it a lot now and then, how I actually felt when I was operating. I certainly didn't feel special. It was almost like doing a job. And as I mentioned before, she was looking after me. So thank you. We'll take questions. And then afterwards, if anybody wants to look at this stuff here, I can open up these books for you, my log books here. A scrapbook that my wife made. A couple of books on the Lancaster, and that's a picture of the Lancaster there. One thing, everybody had a good luck charm. This was mine. It's a hunting knife. And that went with me everywhere. And I still hang on to it. Okay, question.
What kind of armament did you have on the Lancaster?
Early, they had a metal plate. I think it was about maybe almost a ½ inch thick, that was exactly the shape of the back of the pilot's seat. And he was the only one that had any armor.
I'm talking about your guns.
Oh, the guns. They were 303. We had 4 in the rear turret, 2 in the mid-upper turret, and 2 in the front turret. So we had 8 guns, 303s. They wouldn't do a lot of damage, I don't think. But there was tracer, and that apparently bothered the Jerrys as much as anything. But some kills were verified, so there was enough power in those to shoot down if you got them in the right spot. We didn't take credit for shooting down any. We shot at a lot of them. We had a system which we call corkscrewing. As soon as the gunner would pick up an enemy plane coming in on you, and they usually came in from the rear or near the rear, Although the Jerrys later on did get an upward firing cannons that were mounted in a night fighter, 20 millimeter, and they'd fire those up. They'd come in under you and fire them up in your underside. And of course the boffins, as they call the technical people in the RAF, they would, as soon as the Jerrys thought of something, they'd think of something to counteract it, or vice versa. And as soon as those upward firing 210s, ME-210s, came on the scene, it wasn't long, and the boffins had a thing they called carpet. and it was a sonar-like system where they could pick up the wireless operator or the radio operator was the guy that operated it, and he could pick up a plane under you. And in most cases, by the picture that he got on his screen, he could identify it. Is that?
Yes. Did you have the equivalent of a vulture?
No, we didn't. Underneath, we had a dome underneath, but that's where the scanner was for our, what was called the H2S. That was a sonar system for navigation. And we could pick it up on a screen if it was a river or a coastline or a town that was a particular shape, you know, either had a river running through it or was a lot of large buildings or whatever. That would come up on the screen by the navigator, and that's the way he'd get his fixes, using that H2S, they called it, which was like a sonar system. It would send out a signal, and then what they got back made the picture. Rod would understand that. I don't.
You mentioned that the tracers bothered the Germans, so I take it you usually flew with fighter cover?
I can't hear you. Can you stand?
You mentioned that the tracers bothered the Germans, and
Was that because you flew with fighter cover and the fighters?
We didn't have fighter cover. The U.S. Air Force did. We went at night. The RAF started the war in '39 with the idea that they would fly in the daytime. They soon found out that the losses were so great that they'd rather go with it's hard to believe, but it was true, the prediction, I mean, the preservation, let's say, of the darkness. And when the U.S. Air Force came into it, they decided they would take the daylights, but they would go with fighter cover, and they would go in formation. We flew our crews, each navigator, he plotted, and we flew his course. So that's how the different, they took the days and we took the nights, and sometimes they'd go to a target in the daytime, we'd go that same night to that same target. Bomber Harris had the idea that Bomber Command could settle the war. He thought he could cause enough destruction on the continent that the Jerrys would give up. Well, it wasn't true. They hung on right to the end. They had a lot of pride and a lot of guts. And I said many times, if the Germans had had the resources that we had, we'd be speaking German.
I have a question over here.
What was your home base? Where did you take off?
England, of course. The first squadron I was on, 625 Squadron, which was main force. That was just flying over and dropping bombs. Was at a place called Kelstern, which was near Doncaster. Do you know where that is? Well, it's above the Midlands, and it's over towards Hull. You know where Hull is? Hull is on the east coast of England. Well, that's about the middle part of Britain, UK. Then when I went on Pathfinders, I went down near Cambridge, which is further south. It's not too far from London. Does that give you an idea?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to hear more about bombing of Dresden. Did you know that when you took off that it was going to be such a horrendous bombing? And how did you feel as you saw the bombs fall and the destruction?
That's a very good question. When they briefed us for Dresden, and Chemnitz too, and Hamburg, those are the three big cities where they were, the intelligence officer always gave you a reason for going. And his statement was, and you won't like this, the center of arms and legs. It turned out those three targets got such bad publicity that, for example, originally Churchill was in favor of doing that. That was Harris's idea, this massive location bombing, not strategic. You know what I'm saying? It was just do as much destruction as you can. And we were going on these trips carrying, well, it depended. We used incendiaries on those three targets, and of course that caused huge fires. Those towns burned for weeks, and you could see the fire from 100 miles away at 20,000 feet. Is that what you had in mind? See, Churchill wanted to do this, and then when it got all this bad publicity, he's a good politician, he denied that he had any part of it. So Harris, Bomber Harris, our head man, he had to take the blame for the whole thing. But basically the idea was, and the Germans said, like for example, Dresden, maybe you've read some of the articles, the Germans said that there were 220,000 civilians killed in that raid. We didn't know, we were just doing what we were told. But the intelligence officer said the center of arms and legs, and that pretty much tells you what the idea was. But in every case, they could find an industrial target at the same time. I mean, they were clever that way. And for example, Dresden, well, there was two things at Dresden. Dresden was factories that were producing electronics, which was important. Plus, it was an R&R center for the Germans from the Russian front. So between the two, they tried to use that as their reasoning. But in my logbook, it says center of arms and legs, because that's all I knew. But a lot of, you know, the Canadian broadcasting system produced a program after the war that was very critical of the RAF and the Dresden raid. But, and I understand, there's cases still in court over that thing. People that, you know, lawyers, they get going.
Yes, sir.
I'm interested in, you said that your gunner said he quit, so you all quit.
Yeah.
Is that something that pilots could do?
Well, it's what
You
I
just
did.
quit?
It's what I did. When we did 30 trips, you were allowed to be posted for an instructor or something like that. You're not necessarily held in.
Okay.
Of course, we were 53 trips, so nobody argued with us. I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, what year was it when you finally quit?
It was March of 45.
Okay.
I started in February of 44, and I did till March of 45. And I filed for a trip back to Canada, and you know, I was awarded the DFC, the Distinguished Flying Cross, which was supposed to be presented by the King, King George VI, who stuttered, incidentally. But anyway, I didn't wait for that. As soon as we decided to quit, I got up to Greenock, Scotland, got a boat back, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of the war. But the war really didn't end until May of 45.
Over here, we have a question.
Are any of your crew members still alive today?
No.
Did
No,
you get together with them in the past?
Yes. In 1977, I went to Squadron Reunion in England. I went a couple times, and my crew that was alive then came to those reunions. And finally it got to the point my crew was gone, and my navigator was the last one to go. It got to the point there was only one guy at that last reunion I went to that I knew. So I felt to go all the way across the ocean to visit with a bunch of people you don't know, I decided I haven't been there since that year.
John?
What was your rank as a pilot?
Well, when I got my commission, it was what the British called pilot officer, which is the same as a lieutenant. And then it went pilot officer to flying officer, which is like a second lieutenant. And then I got flight lieutenant, which is the same as the captain. And that was a permanent rank. But when I was on the squadron, I got promoted to squadron leader, which is the same as a major. But then as soon as I left the squadron, that was only temporary. Well, I got paid for it, you know. Yes.
Did you have an opportunity to fraternize with American air crews? And if so, what were the relations like?
Yeah. Well, two interesting things to that question. After I had gotten my crew and was starting to operate out of England, the U.S. Air Force came around again and tried to recruit me again. And then they had me once, but they turned me down. And then they came around again and wanted me to sign up again. And I would have, and they said, you sign up and we'll automatically make you a citizen, and you'll be in a U.S. Air Force uniform, and you can either stay here on the squadron or you can, and what bothered me was they said, we might want you to go to the Pacific. I said, I'll stay where I am. And after the war, of course, I came back and I went to Queens and started work. And the first job I had was with a company that was building equipment for Rickover's Navy, and which I had to have a secret clearance, which meant I had to be a citizen. You'd be amazed what the Navy can do. The Navy was had the security coverage. I was a citizen pretty quick. To give you an idea, I had to go to Buffalo to appear before an immigration officer. And when I went in the office, he said to me, I see here you're short of 2 signatures. He says, can't you go down in the street and find somebody that'll sign for you? Okay. Yeah.
Did you fly the same plane, or did you have different planes through the 53 missions?
You mean the same model?
No, the same plane, like, you know, with the Memphis Belle, we had names like that.
It depended on maintenance. But most of the time, my plane was oboe. And you know, the British have they drop the H's, so we called it a hobo. And we painted a picture on the side of it, or we had, you know, they had people there that could do it. It showed a hobo walking along with his stick and a big, we call bandana with a nearly naked girl swinging back and forth, and that was our oboe. And that was their, you know, the phonetic language was a little different. Like the Americans, O was orange, and the RAF O was oboe.
When you first started out, you said you was interested in being a 51 pilot, right?
Yep.
Well, I became a 51 pilot.
Did you?
I
A
would
Mustang.
say so. But then I wanted to ask you too, did you do any flying after the war? Or?
You know, I thought when I came back, I really knew how to fly, and I'm going to call Air Canada and see if they need a pilot. Well, the guy said to me when I talked to him, he said, "We train our own pilots." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, the passengers don't like doing steep turns." So that was the end of that. But because I had gotten my wings on single engine, I thought the idea of what the Mustangs were doing, they were doing tactical bombing, they were shooting up trains and convoys, and boy, I thought that's great, low level, you know, that's for me. But they didn't think the same. And I got a confession to make. The day they told me I was being posted to multi-engine, I went to the bar. And when I came out, at that time I was stationed in Bournemouth, which is on the south coast of England. And our mess was up on this hill, and where we lived was over there on that hill. And we used to ride bicycles. And there was a voice, I don't know if you ever heard of him, Lord Haw Haw. Well, he said one time on the radio, that most of us heard anyway, he said, "We know all you Canadians are there in Bournemouth, but you'll kill yourself on the bicycles." Well, he was pretty much close to right.
Came back from a mission. How did you guys wind down? Base when you got back, you enjoy yourselves. You had a couple of days off before another mission came up.
Everybody hear that? No. How did basically Bill and his crew wind down after a mission? How did they go about enjoying themselves?
Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly considered enjoyment, but we had debriefing. And you went in to this debriefing area, and they'd had a mug of tea like this for you with 2 or 3 shots of rum in it. And so when you went into, you were pretty loose. And the debriefing was the start, and then after we were debriefed, which was by intelligence people, we used to go to the mess, and maybe that's when you'd have your egg, or maybe you'd go to the bar first. Somebody asked me over here about mixing with the U.S. Air Force. Can you hear me over there? Yes. Who was it? Asked about mixing with the, I got diverted one night. I came back, and the aerodrome that I was supposed to land was my home base, was fogged in. And we hadn't gotten FIDO yet. I didn't tell you about FIDO. But, so I got diverted to a U.S., an aerodrome that was U.S. And of course, they had a much better bar than we did. And we had a boot, our flying boots came up to here, and they were kind of like a suede outside, and inside they were sheepskin, and the lower part of the boot could be converted. There was a knife pocket inside the boot, and with that knife you could cut the threads if you got shot down, and you had a walking boot. It was very clever. Well, the U.S. Air Force were fascinated by those boots. And when I landed at this place and had to stay overnight and everything, they were making me all kinds of offers for my boots. And I finally agreed. I got a big fur jacket from this one guy, and he got my boots. And as we were talking, well, yeah, that was my one time I fraternized with them. Of course, we did off and on, I think, different ways. They used to come and see how we were doing things, and we'd go there to see how they were doing things. And I did 9 missions in the month of August of '44, and I think my CO thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. I don't know what, but anyway, he called me in and said, "You're going to Oxford for 2 weeks at the university there." It was a course to promote the relationship between the Allies and the different. There was a general there and a major here, and we had a great time for 2 weeks there, because we were in Balliol College, which is the best beer at Oxford. That was a bit of a nice trip. And of course, when I got back, I was all relaxed, and I guess I didn't get that nervous breakdown or anything close to it.
Can you tell us when you got hit with friendly fire?
Pardon?
Can you tell us when you said you got hit
Oh,
with friendly fire?
That's quite a story. I was on this is when I was still in the training command in England, converting to multi-engine. And this particular night I was flying a 4-engine Halifax, which is like a Lancaster, except it didn't fly as nice as the Halifax. And I was put on a diversion trip. And we went to Saarbrücken. And we came back across the channel, and we were going towards Hull. And I could see the searchlights and the flak coming up in Hull, from Hull. And you know, they had flak ships even out in the channel. And I said to my navigator, "We got to turn." And he said, 30 seconds. That's the way he was. And so anyway, we turned. But as we turned, the Jerrys were bombing Hull, and they came out right under us. And the defenses of Hull were predicting them coming out. They were predicting these Jerrys, and of course we caught it. And we lost an engine. Nobody got hit. And the engine, and of course we limped back to base, but we didn't have that far to go. And we landed, but the engine that we had lost was the compressor for the brakes. So we didn't have any brakes. And I hadn't made a 3-engine landing before that, so I figured I'm going to come in hot. We usually, in a Halifax, we used to come over the fence at about 95 miles an hour. Well, I figured 110 would be good. So I get it down on the runway, and we're tearing down the runway. And the English had a happy faculty of always building a stone house at the end of the runway. And I thought, I'm not going to get to that. So I opened up the outside engine on the opposite side and swung us right out into the mud. And we spun around. I was surprised that the wheels stayed up. And it did, and it spun around and stopped. And I'm my mid-upper again. he's standing outside the door when I go to get out. He says, "You know what, Skipper? There's over 200 holes in this thing." But nobody got hit. But it was a brand new plane. It had 60 hours when I took it up. They weren't very happy with me. But
And I'd like to thank you for all your service, because I am one of those little English children who depended on you and the Canadians and the New Zealanders, the Americans, for our very lives. And my hometown is Hull.
Oh, Hull.
And I was there that night with my head under the blankets when you were going through what you just described.
Well, you tell them, I'm glad they weren't really good shots. I know they were, but I'm just saying.
And Mr. Mason, about the British being such lousy cooks, you caught us at a disadvantage. We were allowed 1 egg a week,
You're
2
right.
ounces of cheese.
They didn't have much to work
What do
with.
with that?
I'll tell you, we had Brussels sprouts almost every day.
That's why
You know-
you're 91.
I can't face a Brussels sprout today.
It sounds like you may have a free dinner just to
Yeah, right. There you go. No, actually, all of the people that I met over there, the Welsh, the Scotch, the English, were just great people. Just great people. I could get emotional about that.
What is Fido?
Oh, you might know, and maybe you'll agree, the weather over England is terrible.
Yeah, I know.
Even if it's a clear day, it has haze. And you can see vertically, but you can't see horizontally. And Fido, what happened was, when it was fog, what they did on certain fields, they put pipes alongside the runway, and it would sprue out petrol, and they would set that on fire, and the convection would push the fog up a couple of 100 feet. So we would come in on the beam to get over the runway, and then we'd break through the cloud and hopefully get down in 200 feet, which was quite a feat because of the convection, and the plane was doing this, and but somehow or other we got down. My navigator used to say, "Skipper, which bounce do I log us in on?" Anybody else?
Yes, sir.
Maybe just yell it out. Sure.
You said you were on several different types of bombers. Did you have a particular one that was your favorite?
Lancaster. The Wellington was a twin engine. It was very sturdy. It was a geodetic construction for the body, the fuselage. So it could take a beating and would take quite a bit of flak to bring it down. But being a twin engine, you wouldn't, if you got above 10,000 feet, you were doing really well. The Halifax was a 4-engine, radial engines. This is my feeling. It was very heavy, not as responsive on the controls, but it was a tank. I mean, for one thing, the engines, radial engines would take a lot of beating compared to a Merlin. And the Halifax, you were lucky to get up above, say, 19,000 feet. But a a Lancaster, in the winter, you could get up to 6,000 feet. And then there was the Mosquito, which was a twin engine. And that was a great airplane. It would go to 30,000 feet. And my mother's brother lived in England when I went over there, so I had somebody to go drink beer with. That was hard to find. We used to go to pubs, and he was a director of a company there called British Industrial Chemicals, and he was always selling. So I used to go with him a lot. His company was bombed out. No, their offices were bombed out in London, and his residence was bombed out, and so he had moved to Welling Garden City. So on leaves and that, I spent a lot of time with him. He was a great guy. I enjoyed him a lot. He could tell more stories in 5 minutes. He was a real salesman. And he was upset when I decided to go back to Canada after the war, or towards the end of the war. He wanted me to work for him. But I think I made the right decision.
Yes. This is just a prompt. We just celebrated the anniversary of D-Day. You did fly some missions in support of the invasion of in Normandy, did you not?
Yeah, we did. For example, Montgomery, General Montgomery, he was taking his unit through Caen, and he got stopped. The Jerry, particularly the tank group, caused a hinge there for him. So he asked for help, and we went over and bombed Caen. And I guess we did a pretty good job, because some years after the war, I was in Wales visiting a cousin of my wife's there, and he was in Montgomery's. The officers that his whole group, and he told me that when they went into Caen after that raid, he said the Germans had just lined up all the tanks and left them. There was nobody there. He said it was like a ghost town. Apparently the bombing, they weren't very happy with that. So we did one thing, but there was Caen. I can't think of some of the others. I could look in my logbook, but we were in support of the whole movement across the continent, trying to help them out. And there was one, I hate to tell you the wrong side, but this is one thing that happened. We were always close to the Allies on those type of trips. And on one trip, there were supposed to be certain flares dropped. And this happened to be yellow flares to tell them where the bombers were going to hit. And apparently, they made a mistake of where they dropped these yellow flares, and quite a few Canadians they were supporting were killed because of that. And that was a real shame. But mistakes are made.
Yeah.
This is not a W-2 necessarily, but what made you decide to come here to NASA?
I was working for a company in Dunkirk, New York, and we were producing big weldments for a lot of things, and particularly for Rickover's Navy. And I came to Cleveland in the society I belonged to and gave a paper. And Bob Schroeder heard the paper, and he told Ray Davis, who was his personnel guy, hire him.
Thank you. Glad said he didn't know.
Yeah. Well, what was happening is it was very timely because the company I was with was liquidating. So I was looking for a job because I had to eat.
Ray?
It's a good question, though.
You mentioned that your guns aboard the ship were a .303 caliber?
Yeah.
This surely isn't the same as the British sporting rifle with a .303 cartridge, is it?
I think so. I think it's the same size bullet.
Really?
But these were machine guns, of course, that we had.
Yeah. Just
I forget how many a minute, but when you looked at the tracer at night, it was a lot.
Thank you.
Well, that's that.
I have one crazy
All right,
question.
you ask your crazy question, I'll get the gentleman here.
You called Ruhr the Happy Valley.
The Ruhr, yeah.
Ruhr. Is that a wine country?
It's a very heavily manufacturing area, all the way down the Rhine River.
Strategically, it's a happy valley.
Right.
The Allies.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Okay.
I see what prompted that question.
Crazy question.
No, the target, you know, we used to kind of keep track of how many got lost on this trip and that trip and that trip. And there was one town in the Ruhr Valley, Essen. And that was the Krupp's work. I don't know if you've ever heard that name. Well, in the peacetime, it made all types of industrial units, you know, like trucks, and it was a big it'd be almost like Detroit, you know. So that was a popular place, but it was very well defended. And our CO, he had a double-barreled name. His name was Bingham Hall, was his last name. He was just a great leader. And, well, for example, when we